The biting winter wind cut through Jack Reynolds' thin jacket like shards of glass, making him shiver as he clutched a battered cardboard sign. The faded words, "Veteran in need, please help," barely caught anyone's attention as streams of people hurried past him on the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. Jack's once strong frame had grown gaunt from months of hunger, and the weight of his unkempt beard hid the chiseled jawline that had once symbolized a proud soldier. Jack wasn't always homeless. Once, he had been a decorated medic in the U.S. Army, serving bravely in Afghanistan. He had saved lives under enemy fire, but returning to civilian life had been his hardest battle. With mounting PTSD and a lack of support, he'd lost his job, his home, and eventually his hope. Now his days were spent in a haze of hunger and exhaustion, his pride whittled away by countless rejections from indifferent passersby. This particular afternoon, Jack's spirits were at their lowest. The gray sky mirrored his mood, and he could barely feel his fingers through the holes in his gloves. He watched as countless people walked by, their faces turned away as if his mere presence was an inconvenience. He sighed deeply, lowering his sign to rest his tired arms. Then a sleek black car, a Bentley, slowed down in front of him at the traffic light. The vehicle gleamed with wealth, its polished surface reflecting the bleak surroundings like a cruel mockery. Jack's heart quickened. Maybe, just maybe, this driver would show some compassion. He straightened up, clutching his sign tightly as he approached the car, his breath visible in the frigid air. Inside the Bentley sat Victor Harrington, a towering figure in the Chicago real estate world. Victor, in his tailored suit and gold cufflinks, exuded power and privilege. To him, the sight of Jack was an eyesore, a stain on the pristine streets where he conducted his high-stakes business. As Jack approached, Victor's lips curled into a sneer. "Excuse me, sir," Jack began, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I'm a veteran. I'm just looking for a little help, anything you can spare." Victor glanced at him with disdain. "A veteran, huh? Is that your excuse for standing here and begging instead of getting a job?" Jack's face flushed with humiliation, but he stood his ground. "I've been trying, sir. It's not easy out here. Anything would mean a lot." Victor let out a derisive laugh, reaching into his pocket. For a moment, Jack thought he might actually help. But instead of compassion, Victor pulled out a wad of cash and flung it out the car window. The bills scattered on the wet ground, mixing with the mud and slush. "There you go," Victor said coldly. "That's all you're worth." Before Jack could respond, Victor revved the engine and sped off, splashing Jack with a wave of filthy, icy water. As the Bentley disappeared down the street, Jack stood frozen, dripping and humiliated. He looked down at the dirty money on the ground, the weight of his despair pressing harder than ever. Victor Harrington sped away, satisfied with what he saw as a lesson in tough love. In his world, weakness was a choice, and anyone who failed to pull themselves up was undeserving of help. His self-satisfaction, however, was short-lived. Just a few blocks away, Victor's phone buzzed with an urgent email. Distracted, he glanced at the screen, his focus slipping from the road. He didn't see the patch of black ice until it was too late. The Bentley skidded uncontrollably, spinning across the intersection before slamming into a streetlight. The impact was deafening, and the front of the car crumpled like an accordion. Smoke began to billow from the hood as the airbags deployed, smothering Victor in a haze of suffocating dust. Dazed and injured, he tried to unbuckle his seatbelt, but his hands trembled too violently. Panic set in as flames began licking the edges of the hood. Meanwhile, Jack, still reeling from the earlier encounter, heard the unmistakable screech of tires and the crash. Instincts honed from years on the battlefield took over. He dropped his sign and sprinted toward the wreckage, his tired body moving with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. When Jack reached the car, the sight before him was harrowing. Flames were spreading, and Victor was slumped against the driver's seat, struggling to free himself. Without hesitation, Jack yanked open the door, his hands burning against the searing metal. "Hey, stay with me," Jack shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. Victor's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, recognition flickered in his gaze. It was the man he had just humiliated. But Victor's pride was swallowed by the terror of his situation. Jack didn't hesitate. He cut through Victor's seatbelt with a utility knife he always carried, hoisting the businessman's weight onto his shoulder. The acrid smell of burning oil filled the air as Jack dragged him away from the car just moments before it burst into flames. Once they were at a safe distance, Jack laid Victor on the ground and checked for a pulse. It was weak and irregular. Without hesitation, Jack began CPR, his hands moving with practiced precision. A crowd had gathered, their phones recording the scene as sirens wailed in the distance. By the time the paramedics arrived, Victor's breathing had stabilized, thanks to Jack's efforts. As the EMTs loaded him into the ambulance, Jack quietly slipped away, not wanting to face the questions or the spotlight. He disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind a man whose life he had just saved and a world about to be turned upside down. The crackling flames consumed what was left of Victor Harrington's once pristine Bentley, as onlookers murmured in shock. Emergency lights bathed the street in red and blue, but the true hero of the moment had already vanished into the cold night. Jack Reynolds, a man society had cast aside, was nowhere to be found, leaving only the memory of his selfless act in the minds of those who had witnessed it. At the hospital, Victor awoke to a blur of sterile white walls and the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor. His body ached from head to toe, and his mind reeled with fragmented memories of the crash. Flashes of smoke, fire, and a firm but urgent voice pulling him back to consciousness played on repeat. Then came the most jarring image, his rescuer's face. It was him. The man Victor had humiliated just moments before the crash. The thought filled Victor with a mixture of shame and disbelief. How could someone he had treated with such cruelty risk their life to save his? The irony was bitter and undeniable. Meanwhile, Jack sat huddled in his usual spot near a bridge, the distant hum of traffic above him. He had no illusions about what he had done. Saving lives had been his duty as a medic, ingrained into his very being. It didn't matter that the man he'd saved had wronged him. A life was a life, and in the heat of the moment, that was all that mattered. What Jack didn't realize was that his actions had not gone unnoticed. The bystanders' videos of the rescue had gone viral, plastered across social media and news outlets. Headlines screamed, "Homeless veteran saves wealthy tycoon after fiery crash." The juxtaposition of their statuses, Jack, a man with nothing, and Victor, a man with everything, ignited public outrage and debate. Comments flooded in, condemning Victor's treatment of Jack while praising the veteran's selflessness. The story struck a chord, sparking heated conversations about the plight of homeless veterans and the stark inequalities in society. Jack's anonymity only added to the mystique as reporters scoured the streets of Chicago, desperate to find the hero behind the viral moment. Victor, still confined to his hospital bed, spent hours reading the comments. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of genuine guilt, not just for his treatment of Jack, but for the way he had lived his life. He had always believed wealth and power absolved him of the need to care about others. Jack's actions shattered that illusion, forcing Victor to confront an uncomfortable truth. He had spent his life taking, while men like Jack had given everything only to be left with nothing. As the days passed, Victor's regret deepened. He couldn't stop thinking about Jack, where he might be, or what his life must be like. For the first time in years, Victor felt an urgency that had nothing to do with business deals or profits. He needed to find Jack, to apologize, and if possible, to make things right. Victor called his assistant, Amanda Carter, a sharp and efficient woman who had worked for him long enough to know that his sudden interest in charity was uncharacteristic. "Amanda," Victor began, his voice unsteady, "I need you to do something for me. Find the man who pulled me from that car. His name's Jack Reynolds." Amanda raised an eyebrow but didn't question him. Within hours, she had pulled together everything she could find about Jack. The records were sparse. Honorable discharge from the Army, a commendation for bravery during his deployment in Afghanistan. And then, nothing. No fixed address, no recent employment, just a downward spiral that mirrored the struggles of countless veterans. "Mr. Harrington," Amanda reported, "he's been homeless for years. I've narrowed down where he might be, but it's not going to be easy to find him." "Then make it easy," Victor snapped, his frustration more with himself than her. "Check shelters, soup kitchens, wherever he might go. I need to see him." While Amanda organized the search, Jack's life continued unchanged. He avoided the growing media frenzy, slipping further into the shadows whenever reporters came too close. The bridge he slept under had become his refuge, a place where he could escape the noise of the city and the memories of the life he had lost. One evening, as Jack sat by a small fire he'd built for warmth, he heard footsteps approaching. His instincts sharpened, a remnant of his training, but the figure that emerged from the darkness wasn't a threat. It was Amanda, bundled in a long coat, her breath visible in the icy air. "Jack Reynolds?" she asked, her voice hesitant but firm. Jack looked up warily. "Who's asking?" "My name's Amanda Carter. I work for Victor Harrington. He wants to see you." Jack's eyes narrowed at the mention of the man who had thrown money at him in the street. "Why? So he can humiliate me again?" "No," Amanda said quickly. "He wants to apologize. He's deeply sorry for what happened. He owes you his life." Jack studied her face, searching for any sign of insincerity, but found none. After a long pause, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "I don't need his apology," he said gruffly. "I did what I had to do. That's all." But Amanda wasn't ready to give up. "Maybe not, but he needs to apologize. Please, just meet him. If you don't like what he has to say, you can walk away." Jack hesitated. Part of him wanted to refuse outright, to protect himself from any further humiliation. But another part of him, the part that still clung to the belief that people could change, agreed to the meeting. "Fine," he said at last, "but just once. After that, I don't want anything from him." Amanda nodded, relieved. "Thank you, Jack. You won't regret this." As she walked away, Jack stared after her, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He didn't trust Victor, but something deep inside told him that this meeting might be about more than an apology. It might just be the start of something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Victor Harrington paced the grand living room of his penthouse, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Chicago. The city's glittering skyline usually filled him with pride, a testament to his success. But tonight, it felt hollow. He couldn't shake the memory of Jack Reynolds, the veteran he had wronged, the man who had saved his life. When Amanda called to say she'd found Jack and arranged a meeting, Victor felt both relief and apprehension. For the first time in years, he found himself nervous. This wasn't a business negotiation where he could wield power and wealth to secure a deal. This was about facing a man who had every right to despise him. The meeting was arranged at a small cafe near one of the city's veteran shelters. Victor insisted on keeping it low-key, understanding that Jack would prefer privacy. He arrived early, sitting by the window with his coffee untouched, rehearsing what he might say. When Jack walked in, the room seemed to shrink. His presence was quiet but commanding, a testament to the strength that had carried him through war and hardship. Victor stood awkwardly, unsure whether to extend his hand. Jack eyed him cautiously, then nodded, taking a seat across from him. "I didn't think you'd come," Victor began, his voice unusually soft. "I almost didn't," Jack replied, his tone guarded. "But your assistant was persistent. Let's hear it." Victor swallowed, choosing his words carefully. "I owe you my life, Jack. And more than that, I owe you an apology. What I did to you that day, it was cruel. I have no excuse for my behavior. You didn't deserve that." Jack leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Apology accepted," he said simply. Victor blinked, surprised by the lack of anger or resentment in Jack's voice. "That's it?" he asked, almost incredulous. "What else do you want me to say?" Jack replied. "I'm not the kind of man who holds grudges. But if you're looking for forgiveness to ease your conscience, that's something you'll have to earn." Victor nodded, understanding the weight of Jack's words. "I want to do more than just apologize," he said. "I want to help. Whatever you need, money, housing, a job, just say the word, and it's yours." Jack's lips tightened into a thin line. "I don't need your charity, Harrington. I've been surviving on my own for years. What I do need is for people like you to stop treating veterans like we're invisible." Victor was taken aback by the quiet intensity in Jack's voice. For the first time, he realized that this was bigger than a personal apology. It was about acknowledging the systemic neglect that had left men like Jack struggling in the shadows. "I hear you," Victor said, his tone earnest. "But I still want to help. On your terms. What can I do?" Jack hesitated, weighing the sincerity of Victor's offer. Finally, he said, "Come with me to the shelter. Meet the people who've been helping me and others like me. If you're serious about making a difference, that's where you start." Victor nodded without hesitation. "Consider it done." The following day, Victor arrived at the veteran shelter as promised. The modest building stood in stark contrast to the luxury he was accustomed to, but it radiated a warmth that he hadn't felt in a long time. Volunteers bustled about, serving meals, handing out blankets, and offering quiet words of encouragement to those in need. Jack greeted him at the entrance, his posture stiff but his tone neutral. "This is where I spend most of my time," he said. "The people here, they're the real heroes. They do what they can with what little they have." Victor followed Jack inside, his eyes scanning the room. He saw men and women of all ages, some in wheelchairs, others with visible scars, and many with the haunted look of those carrying invisible wounds. A woman approached them, her smile warm but tired. "Jack," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "Good to see you. Who's your friend?" "This is Victor Harrington," Jack replied. He wanted to see the shelter. The woman's eyes widened slightly at the name, but she quickly masked her surprise. "I'm Claire Bennett, the shelter coordinator. Nice to meet you, Mr. Harrington." "Please call me Victor," he said, shaking her hand. "And thank you for allowing me to visit. Jack's told me a lot about what you do here." Claire nodded. "We do what we can, but the need is overwhelming. Resources are always stretched thin, and we're constantly turning people away because we just don't have the space." As they toured the shelter, Victor listened intently to Claire's stories about the challenges they faced: overcrowding, lack of funding, and the uphill battle of helping veterans reintegrate into society. For the first time in years, he felt a pang of shame for the excesses of his own life. When they reached the small medical clinic, Jack gestured toward the equipment, a mismatched collection of outdated supplies. "This is where I help out," he said. "I might not have much, but I still remember my training. Patching people up here gives me purpose." Victor looked around, his mind racing. "What if we upgraded this place?" he asked. "Better equipment, more staff, maybe even expand the facility." Claire's eyes lit up with cautious hope. "That would be incredible, but funding something like that? I'll cover it," Victor said firmly. Jack raised an eyebrow. "And why would you do that?" Victor met his gaze steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because you saved my life, Jack, the least I can do is try to make yours and others a little easier." Jack studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "If you're serious about this, then let's do it. But don't just throw money at it. Be involved. See it through." Victor extended his hand, and this time Jack shook it. In that moment, an unlikely partnership was formed, one built not on pity or obligation, but on a shared desire to create something meaningful. As Victor left the shelter that evening, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. Jack, meanwhile, allowed himself a glimmer of hope that perhaps, for the first time in a long time, things might actually get better. Over the next few weeks, Victor Harrington dove headfirst into the project to transform the veterans' shelter. What had initially been a gesture of redemption quickly became a mission that consumed him. His financial team raised eyebrows when he redirected millions from his personal accounts, but Victor was resolute. This wasn't a business investment. It was a human one. Victor attended every planning meeting, walking through the shelter with architects, medical professionals, and social workers. He didn't want a superficial upgrade. He wanted to create a place where veterans could find not just temporary relief, but lasting solutions. The new facility would include state-of-the-art medical equipment, therapy rooms, job training workshops, and transitional housing units. For the first time in decades, Victor felt like his wealth had a purpose beyond accumulating more of it. Jack Reynolds watched these developments with a mix of skepticism and admiration. He saw Victor's dedication, but part of him still questioned whether the billionaire's motives were entirely altruistic. To Jack, action mattered more than words, and Victor was beginning to prove himself. One afternoon, Victor stopped by the shelter to discuss the progress with Jack and Claire. The construction crews had already started tearing down old walls to make way for expansions, and the noise of drills and hammers filled the air. "How's it coming along?" Victor asked, nodding toward the bustling activity. Claire smiled, her face glowing with gratitude. "Better than we ever imagined. The contractors are ahead of schedule, and the new medical wing should be ready in a month." Victor turned to Jack. "I wanted to ask you something." His voice was unusually tentative. Jack raised an eyebrow. "Go ahead." We're setting up a permanent position for someone to oversee the medical wing, someone who understands what the veterans here need, both physically and mentally. I was hoping you'd take the job." Jack blinked, caught off guard. "You want me to run the medical wing?" Victor nodded. "You've already been doing the work, patching people up, guiding them. You have the skills, and more importantly, you understand them. I can't think of anyone better." For a moment, Jack didn't respond. The offer stirred something in him, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. But it also triggered his insecurities. Could he really step into a role like that after everything he'd been through? After all, he was still sleeping under a bridge. "I don't know," Jack said finally, his voice heavy with doubt. "I'm not exactly the picture of stability." Victor leaned forward, his tone firm but kind. "Jack, no one understands what these men and women are going through better than you. You've been in their shoes. You've lived their struggles. That's what makes you perfect for this." Claire chimed in. "Victor's right. You've already been a leader here, even if you don't see it. This could be your chance to make an even bigger difference." Jack looked between them, the weight of their words sinking in. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice low. "But I'm not making any promises." Victor nodded, respecting Jack's hesitation. "Take your time. Just know the offer stands." As the weeks turned into months, the ripple effects of Victor's commitment began to spread far beyond the shelter. The story of the billionaire and the homeless veteran who had saved his life continued to capture the public's imagination. News outlets covered the transformation of the shelter, showcasing the new facilities and the lives being changed. Victor's generosity inspired other wealthy individuals to step forward with their own contributions, creating a cascade of donations that helped shelters across the city. Social media campaigns called for better support for homeless veterans, leading to new discussions about government funding and reintegration programs. One of the most significant moments came when Victor stood before a room full of city officials and philanthropists at a charity gala. The event, organized by Claire and her team, was meant to raise awareness and funding for veteran support services. But for Victor, it was also an opportunity to confront his own past. Dressed in a sharp black suit, Victor took the stage and addressed the crowd. "A few months ago," he began, his voice steady, "I was given a second chance. Not because I deserved it, but because a man I had wronged chose compassion over bitterness. That man, Jack Reynolds, didn't just save my life. He opened my eyes to a world I'd ignored for far too long." The room fell silent as Victor recounted his journey, sparing no detail about his arrogance and cruelty before the crash. "We live in a society where people like me, people with wealth and power, often forget about those who have sacrificed everything for the freedoms we enjoy. It's not enough to throw money at the problem. We need to listen, to act, and to stand beside those who've been left behind." His speech was met with a standing ovation, but for Victor, the true measure of success was the commitments made that night. By the end of the evening, the gala had raised millions for veteran support initiatives. And more importantly, it had sparked a movement. Back at the shelter, Jack watched the news coverage of the gala with a mix of pride and discomfort. He didn't care for the spotlight, but he couldn't deny the impact Victor was making. The new facilities were nearly complete, and the shelter had already begun to feel like a true haven for those in need. One morning, as Jack helped a young veteran with a bandaged leg navigate the clinic, Claire approached him with a knowing smile. "Have you made your decision yet?" she asked. Jack sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "I have," he said. "I'll take the job." Claire's face lit up. "I knew you would." Jack nodded, a small smile breaking through his usual stoicism. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of belonging, a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. He wasn't just another homeless veteran anymore. He was a leader, a healer, and a symbol of resilience. As construction on the shelter's expansion neared completion, Jack and Victor found themselves standing side by side, watching the final touches being added to the new medical wing. The once opposing forces of their lives had converged into something greater, a partnership that was changing lives. Victor glanced at Jack and said, "I couldn't have done this without you." Jack smirked, his tone light but sincere. "Don't get too sentimental, Harrington. There's still a lot of work to do." Victor laughed, a genuine warmth in his voice. That's the plan, Jack. That's the plan. The grand opening of the newly renovated veteran shelter was a day filled with energy, gratitude, and hope. Banners were hung along the front of the building, and a crowd had gathered to witness the transformation of what was once a small, struggling facility into a state-of-the-art haven for veterans. The press was present in full force, capturing every moment of the celebration. Victor Harrington arrived early, dressed in a tailored Navy suit. For once, the man who usually commanded attention seemed more content to stand in the background, observing the fruits of his efforts. This day wasn't about him. It was about the people who would benefit from the shelter's resources, and the man who had inspired it all. Jack Reynolds, now officially the head of the medical wing, stood near the entrance, greeting visitors. Though his demeanor was as reserved as ever, there was a quiet pride in the way he carried himself. He had traded his weathered coat for a clean, crisp shirt and a pair of slacks, a small but significant symbol of how far he had come. As the event unfolded, veterans shared their stories on stage, each one a poignant reminder of the struggles they faced and the importance of having a place like this shelter. Claire Bennett spoke passionately about the work they'd accomplished and the opportunities ahead. Finally, it was Victor's turn to speak. Taking the stage, Victor cleared his throat, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. This shelter represents more than just bricks and mortar, he began. It represents a promise that we will not forget the sacrifices our veterans have made or ignore the struggles they face. This project has been the most meaningful endeavor of my life, and I owe its success to the incredible team behind it. He gestured toward Jack, who stood off to the side. And to one man in particular, Jack Reynolds showed me what true courage, humility, and humanity look like. Jack, thank you for saving my life, not just in that car, but by showing me a better way to live. The crowd erupted in applause, and Jack reluctantly stepped forward, shaking Victor's hand. Let's not make this about me, he muttered, but there was a faint smile on his lips. After the speeches, Victor toured the new facilities, marveling at the bustling activity. The medical wing was already operating, with Jack supervising as volunteers and staff tended to patients. Seeing the space filled with life and purpose, Victor felt a rare sense of fulfillment. Later, Victor found Jack in one of the private therapy rooms, helping a young veteran adjust his prosthetic leg. When the task was complete, Jack turned to Victor. "You did good, Harrington," he said, his tone free of the skepticism that had once defined their conversations. Victor smiled. "We did good." Months passed, and the shelter flourished. The new facilities brought in more veterans than ever before, offering medical care, counseling, job training, and a safe place to rest. The success of the shelter sparked a ripple effect across the city, inspiring similar projects and drawing attention to the challenges faced by homeless veterans nationwide. Jack Reynolds became a pillar of the community. Though he still shied away from the spotlight, his leadership and dedication were impossible to ignore. He poured his heart into his work, whether it was tending to injuries in the clinic, mentoring younger veterans, or advocating for better policies at city council meetings. Victor Harrington, too, found a new sense of purpose. He continued to fund and support initiatives for veterans, using his influence to push for systemic changes. Though his name often appeared in headlines, he no longer sought recognition. For him, the greatest reward was seeing lives change for the better. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Jack and Victor found themselves on the shelter's rooftop, looking out at the skyline. The soft glow of the city lights mirrored the quiet satisfaction they both felt. "You ever think about how crazy this all is?" Jack asked, leaning against the railing. "A few months ago, I was just a guy sleeping under a bridge. Now I'm running a medical wing." Victor chuckled. "And a few months ago, I was a self-absorbed billionaire who didn't care about anything but himself. Life has a funny way of turning things around." Jack nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's not just life, it's choices. We made different choices, and here we are." Victor raised his glass, a rare moment of indulgence for the usually reserved man. "To choices, then, and to second chances." Jack clinked his glass against Victor's. "To second chances." As they stood there, the city bustling below, both men felt an undeniable sense of closure and hope. Jack had found purpose and dignity in helping others, while Victor had discovered the profound joy of using his wealth to make a difference. For Jack, the journey had been one of survival and rediscovery. For Victor, it had been one of redemption and transformation. Together, they had created something far greater than either could have achieved alone, a legacy of compassion, resilience, and hope that would endure long after they were gone. In that moment, they were no longer a homeless veteran and a billionaire. They were simply two men who had chosen to make the world a little better and succeeded. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this heartfelt story. Jack and Victor's journey reminds us all that kindness and second chances have the power to transform lives, not just for one person, but for an entire community. If this story touched your heart or inspired you, please leave a like to support us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our future meaningful stories. Feel free to share this video with your friends and loved ones to spread the message of hope and compassion. Once again, thank you so much for being here with us. See you in the next story.